So this week's discussion is going to center around postmodernism. And we're going to start off by talking about Jan van Toorn, who was a Dutch designer who embraced a more idiosyncratic and personal style. So we're starting to see style going back to the Dadaism. We're sort of having a disregard for rules and orderliness, as opposed to the international style, which was a style that was focused on universal harmony and clarity. So Van Toorn was very radical at this time. He had a reputation as a designer and an educator, and he was very interested in all forms of propaganda, manipulation, and dissemination of information. So he was looking to let the viewer be aware of the mechanics of the manipulation of his design. His work was meant to be provocative and unfinished, and he wanted the public to be able to measure the motives of the producer and mediator that lie behind the product against their own experiences of the world. So he almost wanted to leave things not fully open to interpretation, but kind of give the viewer a sense of where he was coming from with his work. His emphasis was on stimulating the viewer rather than creating something beautiful for them to look at. And he wanted to kind of engage in interactivity with the viewer. So here when we're seeing this margin where the text appears overlapped by this slab serif font right here, we're kind of seeing the throwback to Dadaism. We're seeing a revival of the chaos that took place during that movement. Of this time period was that artists wanted to be seen as people who interpreted what was happening at the time into their work. Their work was a product of the influence of society around them. And overall, they wanted to give everything a personal touch. They wanted to make it very obvious that somebody had put their hand into creating things. And as part of the self-awareness, they also used historicist references, meaning a lot of times, maybe unbeknownst to the viewer, the artist would take previously created styles and use their influence into the modern work. So we're getting recent enough, we're in the 60s and 70s, where people were starting to recycle older styles. So we'll see a little bit more of that as we go forward. This is an image by Wes Wilson, and this was one of the first images of the psychedelic movement. So the font, if it looks a little bit familiar to you, that's because they were using similar things in Art Nouveau design. Also the stacking, how we have everything confined to these two rectangles here, that was also a very Art Deco theme. So we've got that Art Nouveau influence, Art Deco, where the font is basically flowing in these waves to kind of create a greater image, and the letters are blocky enough to support how we can actually view this image. And if you're wondering why this is hard to read, or if you just can't read it, that was almost intentional. And a lot of times right now people were under the influence of psychedelic drugs, which were legal in California until 1966. So this was definitely a reflection of that visually. So in case people couldn't read what was actually on the poster, there would be much more legible fonts right up here and below detailing the specific information of the time of the event, how much the tickets cost, etc., etc. So it's also important to note that around this time there was sort of a counterculture that was developing, especially in response to the music that was being created at the time. People were trying to kind of go against the norm, and this new group of people who were following this artwork, who were looking at these posters, attending the musical events, they almost probably had no idea that this came from an Art Nouveau influence. They were not aware that these were recycled design concepts. So just wanted to make that clear. This is another image from Wes Wilson. So again, you can see that the text is forming almost a flame-like design, but it's very difficult to read. But if you want to hear more about the information such as the ticket outlets, you can look at the bottom of the image. So just want to give you a little more idea of this type of artwork. So this image was also appearing in the book, and this was by the artist Victor Moscoso. It's called Youngbloods from 1967. So this particular artist actually did get a formal arts education, which was probably seen is not necessary or even possibly undesirable by his peers at the time. Um, but what I thought was nice about this was how you are more or less seeing the reflection, the visual reflection of the effects of psychedelic drugs. You're almost seeing this almost trippy design as the letters extend right off the page, up here and down here. And also the movements of the figures is kind of reflected by the movements of the text within their bodies. So it's very metaphysical. It's got a lot of vibrant color, and the image really projects a particular vibe of the time. The lettering is influenced directly by the secession style, but interestingly enough, this seemed to go really well with the psychedelic time period. So it lent itself perfectly, even though it was something that was created several years back. Another poster by Victor Moscoso. Definitely great use of color here, almost optical illusions in the background. And he worked a lot with color lithographs as well. And another image by him for the Miller Blues Band. So you can definitely see that there is this enormous influence of this underground culture. We see a lot of highly sexualized imagery, a lot of otherworldly, surreal type color schemes, and just if you look at it too long, the orange or the blue almost make your eyes start to see movement in the image. So, image from the magazine called Oz. This is by John Goodchild and Virginia Clyde Smith. And this was a first example where there didn't have to be a lot of legibility in design, and clarity was not the sole concern of the artist. This magazine was a social and political satire and not just a lifestyle magazine. It contained a lot of anti-Vietnam War propaganda as well. It contains a lot of mismatched type, from here to the comic book type of onomatopoeia languages to this right here, and a lot of the images just don't really seem to correlate with one another. A lot of it is layered on top of itself, and the colors are extremely vibrant. Almost looks like a living collage, very intense and vibrant. And this is one of the first instances of pop art using the comic book drawings within the image's collage, and with no context or explanation about this right here. The viewers were entitled to create their own opinions, and eventually the magazine was brought up on obscenity charges, which was something that they actually celebrated because they were trying to be associated with this counterculture underground movement. Neon colors in the outfits that the Beatles members are wearing for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band's album cover. And this is kind of amidst sort of a collage background. And this collage is made up of wax figures from Madame Tussauds Museum. And we've got lots of celebrities in here, including Marlene Dietrich and Edgar Allan Poe, and even the Beatles themselves right over here. So this image, this created image, this amalgamation was by Peter Blake and Jana Hayworth, and this was meant to bring down the hierarchy of fine artwork, and this was a more of copied and pasted together image, something a bit more applied or crafty, if you will, and trying to show that this is just as important as the formal paintings of the time. and before the time. The book also points out that there were a lot of independent graphic design firms, and so next we're going to be talking about some of the things that came from Pushpin Studio in the 1960s in New York City. This was founded a decade earlier by Seymour Schwast and Reynold Ruffins, Edward Sorrell, and Milton Glasser. So their movement, their goal was sort of in opposition of the Swiss International typographic style. They were going back to the Victorian use of mixing random fonts together. We're seeing a resurgence of the wooden type, not a Victorian revival, but rather sort of a message saying, an allusion to the Dadaism, basically violating all sorts of different graphic rules and expectations, throwing the expectations on their heads, using lots of grotesques. So the Pushpin Monthly Graphic was more of a trade publication than anything else. It wasn't explicitly a journal. And this image was a boxed grid featuring different illustrations and clip art and designs and lettering styles, much like a catalog. The colors kind of give it a sense of flow, sort of a whimsical pastel palette, but the images themselves don't really seem to have much to do with one another, which is really important. This was meant to make a statement, a political statement about a young boy named Emmett Till who was 15 years old and was murdered in Mississippi in 1955. And this image of him in black and white was shown on top, a very idealized image of the South at the time. And so people, were thinking of it as this glorious, colorful place where everybody was living in harmony, and really, like, the harsh reality was things were not as great as they seemed. So he was trying to use his skill in graphic design to portray that image. Unfortunately, this wasn't as distributed as would have been nice, but at least he was trying to set an example of using design to make statements and to communicate things that were happening in the world. So I thought this was a very nice way of sending a message of protest and activism. And the image is a little bit raw and crude because the black and white image is just kind of thrown on top of the colored background. There's no transition there, there's no framing, there's nothing that ties the two together. So this was definitely another milestone of the time. This was a defining feature of the style of postmodernism. This is an image of Bob Dylan by Glasser, and this sort of epitomizes the psychedelic culture as well as giving a sense of his music and how people received his music at the time. From a portrait done by Duchamp, as well as a Persian miniature painting. This is around this time people were putting up posters in their homes as artwork or to adorn their walls. Just a lot of musical posters. Nice that came out of this movement was Milton Glasser's I Heart or I Love New York image. Then this was called a rebus, and this was meant to use pictures to explain um, a word or a sound element, which kind of just added some nice whimsy to everything going on at the time. This was meant to bring positive attention back to New York in a time of industry and violence and urban decay. And of course, inspired the artist Paul Rand to do a rebranding of the IBM logo with a literal I and a B and then the M back from the original logo. So I thought this was awesome and ingenious. And these images were really good at helping to establish and maintain identities.